This is John, the regular guy amongst all the professors. I just want to remind you that these are recorded. We'll get this one up in the next couple of days once we've got it loaded, because Steve SFT, as I call him, Steve Tucky, is get those up there for us. I wanted to let you know we just had a writing contest, and we'll be posting some of the 3 top winning stories of the writing contest on jxnconcon.org if you want to go check it out. They're absolutely free, and we'll put them in a book. The other announcement is that next week is the 8th, and we will be doing our giveaway of some materials that Stephen has so graciously given us. There's signed copies of several things if you saw the picture on our Facebook, but Taboo 4 and 5, Ambush Bug DC Essentials, The World of Neil Gaiman, which has a intro by Terry Pratchett. And then we've got Salimba, is that right? Yeah, Salimba, which was Stephen did some spot illustrations for, and there's one other book that I'm forgetting. But there's lots of cool stuff. They're all autographed, and we'll just, if you win next week, we haven't figured out the details, but we'll get them out to you, and it'll probably just be something random or whoever comes or whatever. But we might have enough for everybody, so no worries. It'll just be a pecking order thing. So, and if you want the taboos 4 and 5, there's 10 of those, I think. So those are really awesome. I have a couple. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And look out for those short stories. They're local area artists from Jackson. So they're all about reanimation in some way, shape, and form. We actually got a comedic piece, which was pretty good. A straight up like Frankenstein reanimator piece, and then a kind of a twist piece that were really well done. And that's all I got. You got anything, SAS?
No, I'm good. I'm just waiting for it to start.
Okay. Want to take it away, Stephen?
I see Stephen Tucky has been muted. Did you do that again, John? Or?
No.
Oh, okay.
I did it. I did it to myself.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I muted myself.
Hi, everybody. Steve Bissette here, talking to you from the Mountains of Madness in Vermont, where I happen to live and work. We are here tonight for part 2 of a 2-part lecture, but this is a self-standing unit. If you missed part 1, the recorded part 1 is up on the website, and you can revisit it at any point in time. But if you missed it, please stay tuned, because I think you'll enjoy tonight's regardless. It's not a prerequisite that you'd seen it. There will not be a test after, and I hope you enjoy yourselves. A couple of things I'll mention. If you have questions or comments during the talk, I cannot see the chat. Once we're sharing my screen, I can only see the image that you'll be seeing. But feel free to chime in, and Stephen, or John will merrily interrupt me if it's pertinent. And if not, we'll get into it at the end of the talk. The first session was about 90 minutes. Tonight's going to go a bit longer because I have more to share with you. And I love dinosaurs, so it may be hard to shut me up. We may be here still 1, 2, 3 a.m. We'll see. Okay, and please keep your questions pertinent to the subject at hand. We've got another whole series of lectures coming up. Next week is the final presentation in this 2021 series, and then there's another batch that ConCon is presenting from January to the end of February. So hopefully, if there's something you're dying to ask and it's not pertinent to tonight's session, save it up for when we hit that topic, or for the very end of everything at the end of February of this. Okay, I'm ready to go. If you're all ready to go, let's see here if I can share my screen. Yeah, let's give this a go. Okay. Slideshow. Play from current slide. Bingo. Share. Oh, it failed. Sorry. Okay, let's try it again. I do apologize. Share screen. Let me bring it up first. And now we'll share. Is everybody seeing this? Yes. Okay, we got a thumbs up. Great. Well,
Yes.
hello. Welcome to Paleo Pop Primer, part 2. In part 1, we covered a lot of ground, and I've got a little slide coming up that I'll hit the pertinent points again. But first, I want to talk to you about what we're not going to be covering tonight. For instance, we will not be covering scientific accuracy in paleo pop culture because, to be frank with you, very little is accurate in paleo pop culture. I will not be discussing, I will not be discussing extraterrestrial dinosaurs, even though there's quite a few of them in pop culture. Here's a little selection. That's from the Russian film Planet of Storms on the left. That is the supposed dinosaur from Women of the Prehistoric Planet at center screen. That's a Steve Ditko fanzine cover from 1965. And the world famous Burt I. Gordon film King Dinosaur. Nor will I be getting into the completely inexplicable Prehistoric Planet films that all popped up in the mid-60s. Here's a little selection of some of those movies. These used to pop up on TV all the time, and now they are readily available to you on Blu-ray, DVD, etc. However, I do have to note one film that I promised I wasn't going to talk to you about, which is Planet of Dinosaurs from 1977. And I wanted to bring it to your attention because it showcases a procession of almost a dozen completely original stop-motion animated prehistoric creatures. There is a cameo appearance of the Rhedosaurus from the 1954 Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And that imaginary dinosaur appears in this film with the permission of its creator, Ray Harryhausen, who visited the stop-motion animated set of this film. And this movie provided footage that you have seen in many, many other films, particularly if you are addicted to really bad cavewoman movies. I am not going to discuss any invisible dinosaurs tonight, even though there are indeed many invisible dinosaurs in comic books, and there is actually an entire invisible dinosaur movie released here in America as Sound of Horror. I am not going to talk about Saurian shapeshifters or were dinosaurs, even though some have appeared in comic books, like My Buddy Was a Killer Dinosaur in Star Spangled War Stories number 124, and the current not hit on Blu-ray and DVD, the Velocipaster. I am not going to talk about detective dinosaurs. I am not going to talk about Dino Cops, because to do so, I would have to talk about Whoopi Goldberg and Theodore Rex. I'm not going to do that. I am not going to talk about telepathic or telekinetic dinosaurs, even though I grew up reading comics that featured them, and even though I drew one for the Image comic series 1963, issue number 2, The Fury. Because my kids were addicted to the Land Before Time movie and direct-to-video titles, there will be no talking or singing dinosaurs in tonight's lecture. That includes films like We're Back, Barney, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, before I completely leave this topic, I do want to point out to all of you, yes, there are actually 14 Land Before Time movies that went direct to video, all but one, the original film that played theatrically. And I am not going to analyze certain potentially questionable artifacts that I found in the Paleopop fossil records, such as these on the set photographs. I am not going to explain these to you. I'm sorry if these haunt your dreams or nightmares. Okay, so in part 1, I gave a quick overview of the key 20th century paleontological artists. They are by name Charles R. Knight, Rudolf Zallinger, Zdeněk Burian. I also talked a little bit about how in the late 1920s, early 1930s, Sinclair Oil, because they got caught up in the Teapot Dome scandal, had to rebrand their company, and they did so by branding their company with dinosaurs. And it was an incredibly successful corporate rebranding. I covered key aspects of paleontological literature from the 19th into about the mid 20th century. Talked about the great Sir Arthur Conan Doyle novel, The Lost World, which was published in 1912, and the first film adaptation of The Lost World, which came out in 1925. And we had just wound up discussion of pulp magazines featuring dinosaurs and prehistoric themes, and we were right up to King Kong. But before I get into King Kong again, I do want to remind you that in terms of line-drawn animation, cartoon animation, it was Winsor McKay's 1914 Gertie the Dinosaur that really put dinosaurs on the cinema screen, not for the first time, but for the first time where it was widely popular. Also, Willis O'Brien, who did the stop motion animation for the 1925 Lost World, had done a series of short clay animation. And when I say clay animation, I'm not referring to the slang moniker claymation, which a lot of people use to reference all stop motion animation. No, the short films that Willis O'Brien created for Thomas Edison's film company out of New Jersey actually were clay models sculpted over crude wire armatures. He did a series of those between 1915 and 1917, and they were fairly popular novelty shorts. And then in collaboration with a producer and stop motion animation pioneer named Herbert M. Dolly, Willis O'Brien collaborated on a two-reel fantasy film called Ghost of Slumber Mountain. And that's the poster on the left for that film. There's a little bit of controversy, well, a lot of controversy if you're into stop motion animation concerning Willis O'Brien and Herbert M. Dolly. For generations, those of us who grew up loving Willis O'Brien's work, primarily because he was the father of King Kong, would slag and slight the great Herbert M. Dolly. The presumption was that Dolly had attempted to patent stop motion animation model armature frames by cheating Willis O'Brien. It turns out perhaps the opposite is true. Willis O'Brien pulled a fast one on his partner, Herbert M. Dolly, and parlayed that into being able to land the special effects job on The Lost World. Unfortunately, Herbert M. Dolly thereafter left film production. He did one more short film that featured dinosaurs and then moved on to other forms of stage magic and illusionism. But Willis O'Brien stuck with it, and he indeed pioneered prehistoric popular movies with The Lost World. But the movie that really put Willis O'Brien on the map in the popular imagination, and one of the great pop culture figures of the 20th century, is without a doubt King Kong. Willis O'Brien worked with a team of animators. It was not a one-man show. The models were created by Marcel Delgado, who was an amazing artisan and craftsman who designed, under Willis O'Brien's supervision, the models that were used in King Kong. And Marcel Delgado built those models from their stop motion armatures, which were made out of cast steel, all the way up to the skins and the fur on those models. However crude the 1933 King Kong may appear to people today in the year 2021, it was a phenomenal international success. No audience had ever seen anything like it in the 1930s. And any time that the parent studio, RKO Pictures, was getting into financial trouble, they would reissue King Kong theatrically, and it would make a fortune all over again. Unfortunately, by the 1950s, RKO Studios did go under, but before they went under, they sold King Kong into syndicated TV movie packages, and an entire new generation was introduced to King Kong. But prior to that event, in 1952, King Kong was reissued for the 5th time to theaters. And Time Magazine did a full-page feature on it in 1952, citing it as the movie of the week. And it was one of the top 10 box office earners for that year. A remarkable feat for a film that was, by that time, 20 years old. Getting back to line-drawn animation, cartoon animation, after King Kong, you would think there would have been a flood of dinosaur movies, and there weren't, because the expense and the expertise that was required to do the stop motion animation that made King Kong such an incredible on-screen character was prohibitive for most producers. RKO Studios and Willis O'Brien quickly cranked out in the same year, in 1933, the one and only official sequel to King Kong, Son of Kong. But the next landmark in theatrical animated paleo pop culture was without a doubt the dinosaur sequence in the Rite of Spring passage of Walt Disney's feature film Fantasia. This was released in 1940, and the Rites of Spring episode was scientifically ridiculous. You know, the two dinosaurs facing off in this memorable sequence from Fantasia actually existed millions of years apart. They were never going to meet, much less fight each other. And although it's forgotten today, Fantasia was a bomb at the box office. In fact, Disney lost a great deal of money on the film and struggled for a couple of years to regain their footing. Luckily, the work that they did for the Defense Department, animating educational cartoon shorts for the troops, animating cartoon shorts that were used for propaganda, helped them recover. And it really wasn't until the 1968 reissue of Fantasia that the film moved into profit. I first saw Fantasia when I was 13. My mother, who had seen the film when it came out in 1940 and loved it, she had very fond memories of it, took me to the local showing at the Strong Theater in Burlington, Vermont. And the reissue of Fantasia came out right on the heels of the success of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. By the time Fantasia came out, MGM had figured out that audiences were going back to see 2001 2, 3, 4 times, and often doing so in alternate, altered states of perception. My mom, during Fantasia, about like 20 minutes into the movie, leans over to me and goes, "Is someone burning rope in here?" And I couldn't admit to my mom, "Hey, they're smoking joints," you know. But anyway, a fond memory I connect with Fantasia. The next big screen animated cartoon dinosaur appeared in one of the Fleischer Brothers Superman shorts, which, by the way, were state-of-the-art animation for their time. There was a Superman short called The Arctic Giant that was released to theaters in 1942. It involved a dinosaur that thawed out of a glacier and rampages through downtown Metropolis, clearly echoing aspects of the end of the 1925 The Lost World, and especially King Kong's unforgettable attack on New York City at the end of King Kong. As you can see from the image here, it's kind of a goofy looking Tyrannosaurus Rex that was in the Arctic Giant, but such was the state of animated cartoons at the time. The other feature film that I didn't mention last week that I wanted to bring to your attention early on, because part of what I'm going to be doing tonight is bridging what was happening in paleo pop culture in theatrical motion pictures with what was happening in paleo pop culture in comic strips and comic books. In 1940, the real successor to King Kong was a film that was produced and directed by Hal Roach and Hal Roach Jr. called 1 Million BC, and it was released in 1940. It was quite popular in its day. In fact, it was reissued repeatedly into the late 1950s. It was reissued in 1957 or 8 under the title Caveman, and it had already been replaying in theaters a number of times before. The production started with the pioneer American filmmaker D.W. Griffith, originally slated to direct the motion picture. And if you remember part 1 of this lecture, D.W. Griffith is the man who really initiated paleo pop culture in films with the back-to-back live action short films Man's Genesis and Brute Force. Griffith apparently stayed with production long enough to cast the film. He discovered Carol Landis. He cast her as the female lead in the film, and this launched Carol Landis's career. And he also had a hand in casting Victor Mature. And even though Victor Mature never lived down in the rest of his career that he had played Tumac, a caveman, in 1 Million BC, this was one of his earlier popular hits that made him a star. The special effects were by a team led by Roy C. Wright and Frank Young, and I'm going to talk about the special effects in just a moment. And the dinosaur, quote unquote, footage from this film was recycled in almost innumerable feature films and TV shows: Tarzan's Desert Mystery, Jungle Manhunt, Two Lost Worlds, Untamed Women, Robot Monster, Valley of the Dragons, and so on. The sequence that was most often used, this is a scan from a cine-roman. Cine-romans are comic book format adaptations of feature films in published comics form that were very popular in much of Europe and very popular in Mexico and Central America and parts of South America. This is a double-page spread of the cine-roman for the Jungle Jim movie Jungle Manhunt. And from panel 2 to the final panel on the second page, this is all footage from 1 million BC, from 1940, in which a pygmy alligator with a rubber fin on its back is presented as a Dimetrodon, if you will, and it battles a tegu lizard. The SPCA was not supervising film productions at this time. In the 1930s and 40s, in Westerns, they were still using tripwires for stunts involving horses, which would often injure the horses to the point where they had to be killed after the shot. These lizards were tormented for this special effects sequence. But this is the footage that my generation grew up seeing literally hundreds of times on television. 1 million BC was popular enough that in 1967, when the British motion picture studio known as Hammer Films had a great success in 1965 with their adaptation of H. Rider Haggard's adventure novel, She, that Hammer decided they needed to do a follow-up. What property was out there that would serve as a, widescreen, primitive set adventure film with a prominent female lead? Well, they settled on remaking 1 million BC, starring Raquel Welch in the 1966 remake 1 Million Years BC. Now, the original 1 million BC from 1940, the special effects included elephants with fur on them to simulate woolly mammoths, right? That's okay. I mean, those are actual elephants. They made them up somehow to resemble woolly mammoths. There's an incredible volcano eruption at the end of the film. And if you're at all interested in seeing 1 million BC, I primarily recommend it to this day for the volcano footage. It's an astonishing eruption sequence. And the special effects for that also were used again and again and again and again for 20, 30 years afterwards. But it also featured that savage battle between the pygmy alligator and the tegu. When Ray Harryhausen supervised the stop motion animation special effects for the remake in 1966 of 1 Million Years BC, that sequence was supplanted with a pretty spectacular battle between a triceratops and the horned carnosaur Ceratosaurus. Also in the 1941 million BC is an incredibly underwhelming sequence with a man in suit Allosaurus. And this is a behind the scenes shot from the set of the poor stuntman being packed into the Allosaurus suit. There's no official name in the special effects community for this kind of special effects work. Fandom has embraced the term suitmation for man in suit monster special effects. So I'll use that tonight, suitmation. But when Ray Harryhausen was supervising the special effects for the Hammer Films 1966 remake, he put together one of his most brilliant stop motion special effects sequences in the battle with the Allosaurus. And a simple comparison of the Allosaurus battle between Victor Mature and the poor bastard that was stuck in that suit, compared to the Allosaurus sequence from the 1966 remake is pretty astonishing. If any of you are ever teaching a class in special effects, or you're just interested for your own entertainment, compare these two sequences night and day, my friends. Okay, the next breakthrough film that I need to bring to your attention is the first full color dinosaur movie, Unknown Island. This was released in 1948. It was released in Cinecolor, which was a lackluster color process that tended to favor pinks and greens. And the special effects, there was some live action puppetry, like that Dimetrodon you see in the poster on the left. That was like a little, like about an 8-foot puppet of the Dimetrodon. The bulk of the dinosaurs were done using suitmation. Those dinosaur suits of the Ceratosauruses were created by special effects man Ellis Berman. And I did mention in part one, this film. This is the film where at one point, one of the non-stunt people, it was just sort of, extras they hired and bundled them into these suits. And one of these people actually passed out while in the dinosaur suit. They captured it on film. They didn't edit it out of the film. They overdubbed the sound effect of a gunshot. So it looks like the dinosaur is shot and falls over, but actually the person inside passed out. Luckily, they did save the person. In terms of paleo pop literature of this time, I touched on these two novels in part one. I'll touch on them again. John Russell Fearn, a British writer of science fiction who wrote under a number of nom de plumes, wrote two novels featuring a dinosaur protagonist that he named Herbert the Dinosaur. These two novels are published under the pen name Volstead Gridban. And the first novel, A Thing of the Past, came out in 1953. By the way, it has been reprinted more than once, and I believe there's a print-in-demand edition of A Thing of the Past out there that you can find and purchase online. And A Thing of the Past did so well that the very next year, Volstead Gridban was added again, and he wrote a sequel featuring the even larger Herbert the Dinosaur in a novel called The Genial Dinosaur, in which Herbert saves planet Earth from alien invaders from the planet Venus. So tomorrow morning when you get up and you take your first breath of air, thank Herbert for saving us from the Venusians in 1954. Now, the same writer, John Russell Fearn, also wrote the British novelization of the 1954 3D living fossil fishman movie, Creature from the Black Lagoon. John Russell Fearn wrote the novelization under his other pen name, Vargo Staton. You can see why there won't be a test on this after the talk. This was an incredibly rare movie novelization, very coveted by serious movie novel collectors. Finally, it was reprinted here in the United States in an authorized edition with cover art and illustrations by my good friend Bob Eggleton. And that was published in 2011 by Dreamhaven Books in a limited edition hardcover. Now that hardcover is almost as hard to find as the original 1954 British edition. What's interesting about the Gill Man and the Creature from the Black Lagoon is that one of the designers of the Gill Man, one of the reasons that the Gill Man is one of the most believable and the coolest of all the man in suit monsters from the 1950s is that a woman co-designed the Gill Man. Millicent Patrick worked with Universal International's makeup department head, Bud Westmore, and a team of makeup experts. And she was presented to the public by Universal International as the primary shaper and mover of the Gill Man. That is, until while Universal International had Millicent out on the road doing pre-publicity for the Creature from the Black Lagoon, Bud Westmore got jealous, complained to the powers that be at Universal, and not only was Millicent Patrick pulled in off the road, she was fired from the Universal International makeup department. Very recently, there was a book published that I recommend to anybody interested in the history of special effects, or if you're a fan of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I am. It's a terrific book called The Lady from the Black Lagoon, written by Mallory O'Meara. Came out in 2019, still available everywhere. I'm sad to note that the sort of official studio ban against Melissa Patrick is still alive and well. At least one event that I know of that Mallory was invited to speak at, her talk was canceled and the invitation reneged upon because of a complaint from the studio. Also in 1954, actually the year before, 1953, the movie that was one of the #1 box office hits in 1953 was The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It was a motion picture that was produced independently for about $250,000. The co-producers of the film were so happy with the final results when Ray Harryhausen completed the stop motion animation and the post-production was finished on the film. One of those co-producers, a man named Jack Dietz, knew they were onto something, like they had accidentally made something amazing. And Jack Dietz went directly to Jack Warner, the head of Warner Brothers Studio, and sold the film outright to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers bought it for, according to the director of the film, Eugene Laurie, about $450,000. And no doubt the producers were patting themselves on the back. They had essentially doubled their money before the film was even in theaters. Well, they were kicking themselves by the end of 1953 because Warner Brothers pumped another $400,000 into one of the first blanket television advertising campaigns ever put together for a feature film. And before the end of 1953, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms had made over $3 million, which sounds like peanuts today, but in 1953, that was a fortune. Because the producers had sold the film outright to Warner Brothers, they did not get a share of the profits, nor did Ray Harryhausen, the man who created the Rhedosaurus and the stop motion special effects for the film. But the film did launch Ray Harryhausen's career as a solo special effects artist with some standing. The film was so popular around the world that a producer at Toho Studios had the idea of, we should do our own version of this film. And the following year, in 1954, in Japan, an original film came out entitled Gojira. It was imported to America. Additional sequences were shot with actor Raymond Burr playing an American reporter named Steve Martin, no relation to the comedian author. And it was released here in America in 1956 under the title Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And it was a massive hit, and the rest is history. But these two films are locked step in step with one another because Godzilla is indeed a revamp of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. What's interesting to compare, though, is that they also set up the templates for almost everything that followed in the 1950s and 60s on motion picture screens around the world. Ray Harryhausen had created this very believable imaginary dinosaur that he called a Rhedosaurus using stop motion animation and very low budget, ingenious layering of special effects. He called it a reality sandwich, where he would use some models of city buildings and streets, but integrate it with actual location footage that was shot in a city. And in Japan, much as special effects creator E.G. Tsuburaya was a lifelong fan of King Kong and loved Willis O'Brien's special effects, Tsuburaya knew that his producers would not bankroll or wait for the time frame that stop motion animation required. So E.G. Tsuburaya pioneered a combination of suitmation, men in suits playing his dinosaur Gojira, and puppetry. There were some miniature Godzilla puppets that were used in some portions of the film, and integrating those two quite ingeniously. I love both these films. I couldn't pick a favorite if you held a gun to my head. But this is the beginning. This is the branching of paleo pop culture in terms of theatrical motion pictures, with the division between stop motion animation being a preferred method when the effects technicians and the budget and time allowed, as opposed to suitmation, which became the go-to special effects mode for what we now call kaiju. Godzilla was enough of a hit that Toho and E.G. Tsuburaya immediately began work on a follow-up, which was released in Japan in 1955 as Godzilla Raids Again. We didn't see it here in America until 1959, 4 years later. And because the distribution studio, Warner Brothers, did not own the name Godzilla, they released it renaming the giant monster Gigantus, the fire monster. Between that period of time, though, between the time that Godzilla Raids Again was produced and opened in Japan and finally played in America, the first color Japanese kaiju film, Rodan the Flying Monster, was a big hit in Japan and Asia. It was almost immediately imported into the United States by the Distributors Corporation of America, DCA. They did not shoot additional footage for it. They simply dubbed it and got it quickly into theaters. And Rodan was a hit film here in America as well. All these movies very quickly were sold off to television. By the time I was ages 5, 6, 7 years old, these movies were on TV all the time. The first one I saw on TV was Gigantus, the Fire Monster. My favorite of the kaiju that often played in our part of the woods here in New England was Rodan the Flying Monster. But the key films that I want to step away from before getting into comic book history and comic strip history is a trilogy that was directed by the same man. Eugene Laurie was a world famous art director and production designer. He had worked with some of the world's most famous filmmakers, including Charlie Chaplin, and he had done the art direction on the great French film, The Grand Illusion, et cetera, et cetera. But his first film as a director was The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And what that did, unfortunately, was typecast Eugene Laurie as, oh, he's the monster movie maker. Eugene ended up making 3 paleo pop culture classics: The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the British-made film Behemoth the Sea Monster, but it played here in America under the completely redundant title The Giant Behemoth, and probably the most beloved of his 3 films, Gorgo, which came out here in America in 1961. It was a major color release. It was released by MGM Studios. Eugene Laurie, later in his career, related the story that he really owed it to his daughter that he made Gorgo. His daughter was a young girl when Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was completed. And when Eugene took his daughter to see the film at the preview, at the end of the film, she was mad at her father. She said, "You killed the dinosaur." And Eugene decided he would, if he ever made another dinosaur movie, he would have the dinosaur live. And that turned out to be Gorgo, which is part of the reason Gorgo is one of the most beloved dinosaur movies to my generation, because not only does Gorgo survive at the end of the film, his mother comes and saves him. I don't mean to give away the ending of Gorgo, but if you've never seen it, you really should. Okay, let's get into part 3 here. Paleo Pop in comic strips, comic books, and graphic novels. Now, dinosaurs have appeared in so many comic strips, so many comic books, and so many graphic novels already that we can't possibly do justice to it in one night, but I'll give it a try. I'll at least hit the key grace notes in how paleontological themes played through the comics. The first popular prehistoric themed comic series was published in Punch magazine, the very popular British satirical magazine. And it was called Prehistoric Peeps. It was written and drawn by the cartoonist E.T. Reed. And this ran throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. And they were all single panel strips like the one you're seeing here. So if you ever hear anybody try to claim that the Flintstones was the beginning of, you know, cartoon cavemen and dinosaurs, no, it started with Prehistoric Peeps. And Prehistoric Peeps were such a popular feature in Punch magazine by the turn of the century in 1900 that the first British prehistoric themed short live action movie was sold to the public as Prehistoric Peeps, even though it was not licensed with an E.T. Reed or Punch. Copyright laws were pretty fast and loose in the early 1900s, so they got away with it. And there ended up being a short series. I have found evidence of at least 3 silent comedies that were made in England involving cavemen and perhaps fabricated dinosaurs. I've never been able to see one of them, so I don't know. All of them were released as Prehistoric Peeps films. The Prehistoric Peeps were so popular that they were published in a book edition. And that book edition, a very handsome hardcover that was put out by the publishers of Punch, was the only way that a lot of us got to see these strips. I first saw them on postcards at a vintage postcard dealer at a flea market when I was in high school or college. And it took me a while to figure out what they were and where they came from. Here in America, probably there were a number of caveman comic strips that predated Alley-Oop. In fact, there was one called Our Antediluvian Ancestors by R.F. Alcott that was popular in newspapers as early as 1901 and 1902. But the popular caveman dinosaur strip that most Americans are familiar with is Alley-Oop, which was created by a Texas-based cartoonist named V.T. Hamlin. It originally debuted in 1932 in a small newspaper, but it drew the attention of a syndicate, and they licensed Alley-Oop with V.T. Hamlin, and it went international. I was a big fan of Alley-Oop as a kid. I'm lucky that our local newspaper carried it in the Sunday pages. It was popular enough that as late as 1957 or 58, there was a top 40 radio hit called Alley-Oop. What's important to our chronology here, though, is that at one point, V.T. Hamlin decided to incorporate into his Color Sunday pages Dinny's family album. Dinny was the brontosaurus that was the faithful steed of the caveman Alley-Oop. So Dinny's family album was a weekly color one-panel snapshot of a dinosaur as reconstructed by V.T. Hamlin. This was a feature I'd love to either put together or find a collected edition of these, because I always love these. They are not scientifically accurate. I promised we weren't going to get into that, but V.T. Hamlin is not guilty of initiating the cliche of tyrannosaurs and allosaurs hanging their hands down like this. This would involve actually breaking their wrists and would make them susceptible to dying fairly quickly in the wild as predators. The first prehistoric themed comic book series that I have found published in North America was a series called The Hurricane Kids. It was written by Dell editor Oscar Lebec, working with Dell's premier comic writer, Gaylord Dubois. And Gaylord Dubois, along with a man named Paul S. Newman, no relation to the actor Paul Newman. Gaylord Dubois and Paul Newman have probably written more published comic book stories than anyone alive on planet Earth, with the possible exception of friend and associate Chuck Dixon, who's still very much with us and still writing comics. Hurricane Kids appeared in Popular Comics, and the series started in 1939. And the sequence involving the Hurricane Kids being shipwrecked on an island inhabited by prehistoric tribal humans and dinosaurs was written up, novelized, and published as the one-shot hardcover novel, The Hurricane Kids on the Lost Islands. Boy, dinosaurs were in, like, I'm not exaggerating, almost every newsstand comic book had a dinosaur in it at one point or another. You know, Superman fought with dinosaurs. Batman and Robin visited Dinosaur Island. This is kind of a precursor to Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, because the whole premise is it's an island that is a theme park island put together by this eccentric rich person. However, they aren't created genetically, because genetics was not recognized as a popular science at the time this story came out. They're all robots. And if you're wondering, yes, this is where the robot dinosaur came from. This story that was always pictured in Batman's Batcave alongside that giant penny, Lincoln penny. Here's my favorite of the ridiculous comic book appearances of dinosaurs. Wonder Woman, Amazon Babysitter, in which a Tyrannosaurus Rex thaws out of an iceberg, and Wonder Woman is suddenly put in the maternal role of babysitting the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Serious paleontological comic book series, though, you know, I guess it would start with the first adaptation of one of the Edgar Rice Burroughs' Pal O'Dun stories that originally had been serialized in the pulps. The first of the comic book Pal O'Dun Tarzan stories was in Tarzan #6, published by Dell Comics back in 1948. The art was by Jesse Marsh, who also drew this cover. When I was entering the comic book field in 1976-77, when I was a student at the Kubert School, I was ridiculed not only by my classmates, but by some of the guests, visiting artists who came to the school, heroes of mine, because I love Jesse Marsh's artwork. And what has happened in decades since is Jesse Marsh's artwork has been reappraised and is quite beloved by the current generation. So I've been vindicated by time. Later, Dell and Gold Key licensed Tarzan comics would return to Paladin time and time and time again. And I've got quite a sizable collection of vintage Tarzan comics. If they had the dinosaurs in them, I kept them in my collection. The first of the serious comic strip uses of dinosaurs is possibly Frank Robbins' popular adventure strip Johnny Hazard in the late 1940s, around 1948, 49. In his Sundays, he had an entire sequence where Johnny Hazard and a group of his militarized compadres end up stumbling into a sort of lost world plateau where dinosaurs still live. In a lot of ways, this is the beginning of the military versus the living fossils theme that became very quickly a staple of comic books starting in the early 1950s. It's possible there's something that predates this, which is why I'm stammering and hemming and hawing. This might not be the first use of that, but it's possible. Excluding various pulp science fiction stories that might have had a military component. George E. Turner, an independent cartoonist, writer, artist, one of the great film scholars of our generation. George passed away a number of years ago. He did what I consider the first serialized nonfiction paleontological comic strip. It was called The Ancient Great Plains. It ran for a little over a year in an Amarillo, Texas newspaper, the Sunday News Globe. My good friend Michael H. Price, who was a close friend and frequent collaborator and co-author with George Turner during George's lifetime, rescued the entire run of the Ancient Great Plains and collected them into book form, which is how we have them today. It was crude. George was not a particularly refined cartoonist, but he had a lot of life in his drawings. And for the time he was doing this work, this was pretty cutting edge work, but it was only read in Amarillo, Texas. In terms of comic books, really the ground zero, other than Tarzan, of the caveman and dinosaur comic genre, if you will, was Joe Kubert's Tor, which originally appeared in a comic book that was not entitled Tor. It was entitled 1 Million Years Ago. Tor was Joe's great first, creator-owned character. He did it for a very adventurous comic book publisher, St. John Publishing. And with St. John Publishing folded up their comic book operation at the end of 1954, beginning of 1955, St. John deeded all the creative properties that the cartoonists who worked for and with him to the creators. So Joe was in quite a select group of North American cartoonists. In terms of comic books, the only other creator that comes to mind would be Will Eisner, who was creating comic book inserts for newspapers, and that's where The Spirit was originally published, and Will Eisner owned The Spirit, Lock, Stock, and Barrel. So Tor is important, not just in terms of paleo pop culture in the comics, but also in terms of creator rights and creator ownership in the comic book industry here in North America. Much more popular and outliving the short run of Tor was a Dell original comic series that debuted in the fall of 1954 called Turok, Son of Stone. The premise of Turok is that two Native Americans in pre-colonialized North America are out on a hunting trip, and they end up getting swept up in a river and washed into a cave. And when they come out and surface, they find themselves in this lost valley populated by prehistoric animals, primarily a lot of dinosaurs, and various prehistoric tribes. And the entire series is comprised of Turok and his young friend Ander trying to get out of Lost Valley, but they never get out of Lost Valley. When I was in junior high and I had an English class where we were first introduced to the concept of existentialism, about halfway through the class, I realized, oh, I get it. This is like Turok, Son of Stone. Existentialism is just like Turok. They are never going to get out of the valley. They are forever trapped in the valley, but they can never stop trying to get out of the valley. Well, that to me, sort of in a nutshell, is existentialism. Turok was incredibly popular. It lasted well into the 1970s. In the 1980s, it was revived by another publishing house. They bought the license and they resurrected Turok, and he has had a third life as a very popular video gaming star. Turok was great, and when Dell Comics parted ways with Western Publishing in 1962, I won't get into why that all happened, but Western Publishing, who packaged Turok, Son of Stone for the publisher Dell, split off with Dell. And when they split off, Western formed its own comics publishing imprint, Gold Key Comics, and they kept Turok, Son of Stone. And Turok remained one of the top-selling original properties that Gold Key published into the 60s and early 70s. They all had these wonderful painted covers. Most of them were painted by George Wilson. And I own the original art for that cover on the left. I really wish I had the original art for the cover on the right, but never fell into my hands or reach. Now, the important thing about paleo pop culture and comics is that the backup feature in every issue of Tor was a short 2 to 4 page feature called Young Earth. And the artist for the entirety of the series, from 1955 until the end of the Gold Key run of Turok in the 1970s, was Rex Maxon. These short backup features didn't feature Turok and Ander. In fact, there were no human beings in them. These are the first serious comic book attempts to reconstruct prehistoric life, what it might have been for the prehistoric animals that existed on planet Earth millions and millions and millions of years ago. It's quite a remarkable series. It's never been collected anywhere in the world. And I hope someday it will be, because it's a pretty terrific series. In the comic strips, caveman strips got a new lease on life in 1958 when cartoonist Johnny Hart launched the still ongoing adventures of BC. BC was launched in February 17th of 1958. This is one of the early strips. And it was a big hit right from the get-go. And I'm of the generation that grew up with BC being available in those paperback collected editions that you could pick up at the mom and pop store or the local paperback rack. Better known perhaps than BC, definitely better known than Prehistoric Peeps, was Hanna-Barbera's primetime TV series, The Flintstones. It was not a Saturday morning cartoon originally. This played primetime in the evenings. This was animated TV series aimed at adults. It premiered September 30th, 1960. I was watching TV that night. I was 5 years old. I watched it with my parents. And I remember my dad about 10 minutes into the show going, "This is the Honeymooners," right? And my parents loved the Honeymooners, the Jackie Gleason TV series, the Honeymooners from the 1950s. The Flintstones was a huge hit. They're still making Flintstones direct-to-video and direct-to-streaming specials and features and so on. And there's been a couple of live-action Flintstone features. There's even been a XXX rated direct-to-video adult parody called The Flint Bones, but I won't talk about that. Another fixture of this era of comic books were Dell movie comics. These ran throughout the 1950s into the late 60s. And many of the Dell movie comics that this kid would gravitate to in the newsstand were the ones that involved dinosaurs. Adaptations of documentaries like The Animal World. It was an Irwin Allen documentary that opened with a full color stop motion animated sequence about the age of dinosaurs, and the animation was by Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen collaborating. there were many dinosaur movies that made their way into the movie comics. These are all scans from my own collection. The Land Unknown from 1957, the 1960 remake of The Lost World, in which it was dinosaurs wearing rubber frills and horns instead. I mean, lizards wearing rubber frills and horns that we're supposed to believe were dinosaurs, and the occasional stop motion, low budget dinosaur epic like childhood favorite Dinosaurus, in which a Tyrannosaurus Rex, a Brontosaurus, and a Neanderthal man are reawakened from suspended animation by bolts of lightning hitting them. There were certain artists who specialized in this field. For instance, the cover artist Tom Beecham, he painted the cover for the Pyramid paperback release of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World that was in paperback racks in conjunction with that 1960 20th Century Fox film, The Lost World. But he also painted the cover of Kona, Monarch of Monster Isle, first issue in 1962. Now, in 1962, you recall, I told you that Western Publishing and Dell Comics split up their long-term partnership. Western kept the properties that they had the licenses to or that were original to them, including the Walt Disney's characters, the Warner Brothers cartoons like Bugs Bunny, the MGM cartoons like Tom and Jerry, and their original series like Turok, Son of Stone. Suddenly, Dell, who's competing in the marketplace with their former partner, who now has their own comic imprint, Gold Key, Dell knew the sales figures on Turok and decided, we got to create something just like Turok. And that's where Kona, Monarch of Monster Isle came from. Monarch of Monster Isle, Kona, debuted in 1962. The cover art was always painted by a variety of excellent artists doing cover art for Dell. But the interior artwork was by a man named Sam Glanzman, who passed away a couple of years ago. Sam is one of my three real cartooning heroes. And Kona, Monarch of Monster Isle, is one of the comics that I was addicted to. I could never get enough of Kona. And to this day, I will, once every 2 or 3 years, I'll have a dream involving me finding the last issue of Kona that I never knew had come out. I guess I'm still addicted to Kona. My other favorite series when I was a kid in the early 60s, and still beloved to this day by many comic fans and readers, is The War That Time Forgot. It was a series written by editor Bob Kanigher. It appeared in Star Spangled War stories for about 3 years or so, if not longer. The artwork was usually by the team of Ross Andrew and Fred Esposito, but other artists, including Gene Colan, Russ Heath, Joe Kubert, contributed artwork as well later in the series to individual stories. The premise was a one-note premise. The entire premise was that somewhere in the Pacific theater of World War II, there was an island somewhere between Hawaii and Japan where prehistoric animals still lived. And in every issue, a group of American GIs would wash up or shipwreck, or their plane would crash on that island, and they would have to fight dinosaurs. That was it, folks. Issue after issue after issue after issue. But if you were a dino junkie kid like me, what more did we need, right? It really was the silver age of dinosaur comics. And if you're a fan of the contemporary 21st century incarnation of the Suicide Squad, you should know that the original Suicide Squad, co-created by editor-writer Bob Kanigher, almost always featured dinosaurs right from their very first adventure in The Brave and the Bold. Kona was a big go-to for fans like myself. Turok, Son of Stone, I've already talked to you about. But this also meant that some of the key comic creators of the Silver Age of the early 60s, mid 60s, late 60s, like Jack Kirby, returned again and again and again to prehistoric themes, even though they didn't particularly specialize or have a particular obsession or fascination with dinosaurs. Sales figures on comic books, which took 6 months to reach publishers. On the newsstand, a comic would come out, and it took a full 6 months before the final sales figures would be reported back. It became obvious to all the comic publishers that anytime they put a dinosaur And at DC Comics, they also discovered whenever they put a purple gorilla on the cover of a comic book, the sales went up. So there's a lot of comic books that popped up with dinosaurs. Jack Kirby did a number of giant monster stories for Atlas Timely Publications before they rebranded themselves as Marvel Comics. That's one of them on the left, The Amazing Adventures #3. We Were Trapped in the Twilight World. Many of those featured dinosaurs or dinosaur-like creatures. And once the Marvel Age of Superheroes hit, starting in 1962, blossoming in 1963, and going full-blown in 1964-65, this is when artists like Jack Kirby, in collaboration with editor-writer Stan Lee, would reintroduce some of the characters in publisher Martin Goodman's stable. Martin Goodman was the publisher of the Khazar Lord of the Jungle pulp magazine back in the 40s. It's necessary to renew trademark on characters or properties you have out there. So it made business sense to reintroduce Khazar in the pages of X-Men. The Jack Kirby dinosaur comic that was ridiculed when it was new in 1978-79 and is strangely beloved and embraced today was Jack Kirby doing Devil Dinosaur. He was the writer-artist on the series. It debuted in 1978 and involved a semi-simian cave boy named Moon Boy and his close bond, his relationship with this sort of lobster red Tyrannosaurus Rex called Devil Dinosaur. It's funny, Devil Dinosaur, I mean, I was working for Marvel Comics as Devil Dinosaur was coming out. I was doing my first work for Marvel, and I was going up to the Marvel offices, and the editors and the art department up there were ridiculing Devil Dinosaur. There were photocopies of Jack Kirby panels and pages tacked up to the wall where they would mock what was happening, or they would redraw parts of the page or panel to mock Jack Kirby. I saw it with my own eyes. Now, Devil Dinosaur is like this bizarre cult comic, much beloved. It's recently been reprinted in a huge hardcover edition by Marvel, and the character has been resurrected a number of times by Marvel over the years. Steve Ditko also was one of the key Silver Age Paleo comics artists. He, like Jack Kirby, did a lot of one-shot, self-standing, weird comic stories in the 1950s and early 60s. This is Steve Ditko's splash page for The Man Who Crashed into Another Era. A lot of dinosaur stuff. The panel on the right is from Steve Ditko's Charlton comic, which is my personal favorite of his dinosaur comics, Gorgo. This is the Charlton comic licensed spinoff from that 1961 Eugene Laurie directed feature film that I talked to you about a few moments ago. This is not a cover by Steve Ditko, but Steve Ditko did the interior art. I believe this cover is by Dick Giordano, who was one of my teachers at the Joe Kubert School when I attended the Kubert School. Gorgo originally came out as a Charlton movie comic, but it sold well enough, and they had licensed the property from MGM and King Brothers, and they continued Gorgo as an ongoing comic series into about 1967. Now, Gorgo, I only showed you the poster for Gorgo before. Gorgo was a British feature film, not American, not Japanese. But because it was produced on a fairly low budget, even though it was in Technicolor and released by MGM, it was an independent production produced by the King Brothers. And they engaged one of the MGM special effects department technicians, Tom Howard, who created the suit, the man in suit, Suitmation Gorgo. There were actually two suits, one for Gorgo, one for Gorgo's mother. Steve Ditko reinterpreted this for the comics quite spectacularly, and the writer of the Gorgo series was a man named Joe Gill, who wrote thousands and thousands of comic pages for Charlton. If you want to go looking for, there's now hardcover collections of the Steve Ditko Gorgo comics. You can easily find those online, available through Amazon or your favorite book buying site. But if you want to get one comic from this era, actually own the comic, the one I recommend is a 1968 giant annual that Charlton published called Fantastic Giants. Very unusual for 1968. They actually presented, you can see on the cover, a Steve Ditko special, 64 pages of two Charlton classics. What those classics were the Steve Ditko issue #1 movie adaptations of Conga, the giant gorilla movie released by American International Pictures in 1961, and Steve Ditko and Joe Gill's adaptation of Gorgo. And there's two original Ditko monster stories in the comic as well. Fantastic Giants was on the newsstand for like almost 2 years. I mean, I bought a second and third copy while I was in high school, which would have been 70, 71. I also want to bring to your attention, for you Marvel junkies out there, Steve Ditko's Conga and Gorgo. I don't know if Ditko particularly loved that body of work he did. I certainly do. But a lot of comic fans did. And when Tony Isabella was the writer of the Marvel series Captain Universe, Tony Isabella wrote into the script a child version of Captain Universe who has two toy monsters that he calls Congo and Gorga. And this appeared as a backup story in the Web of Spider-Man Annual #6, published in 1990. So that's technically the only return of and the final appearance of Steve Ditko's Conga and Gorgo. Now, in the 1960s, kaiju ruled. Japanese giant monster movies and Japanese science fiction movies were everywhere. There was a new Japanese science fiction movie out, I exaggerate not, every year, often more than one. The big hits of the series in the 1960s here in America, Universal picked up and released King Kong versus Godzilla, which until recently, with the release of Shin Gojira, Toho's most recent Godzilla movie, King Kong versus Godzilla was the top box office grossing Godzilla film of them all, in Japan, in America, around the world. They also began producing Monster Mash sequels. After King Kong versus Godzilla hit, they did Godzilla versus Mothra. But because the American distributor of the film did not have the license to use the name Mothra, Mothra had been released in America by Columbia Pictures, they put it out as Godzilla versus the Thing and made it a mystery what the Thing might be. Well, I'll tell you, the Thing was Mothra. And after that, Ghidra, the three-headed monster, was a huge hit here in America. It was released by an art house distributor, Continental Releasing, who prior to this had been releasing, French films and imports from Sweden and Denmark and around the world. By the mid-60s, Continental realized if they were going to make money, they better start releasing more popular entertainments, and Ghidra was one of their early hits. But the kaiju were coming from every corner of the globe. This is just two of the many kaiju films that came out in the 60s. Reptilicus, the only Danish giant monster movie, right? Made in Denmark. If you've never seen it or heard of it, check it out. Go look on YouTube. Reptilicus is one of the worst examples of live action puppetry being used to create a giant monster on the big screen ever created anywhere in the world. Apparently, my wife and I have been to Denmark twice. In Denmark, it's a joke, but it's also a beloved joke. And I've read interviews with Lars von Trier. Supposedly he has the Danish original poster, one sheet posted of Reptilicus hanging in his office. So there you go. Even India produced its own kaiju films. The main one that opened in the 60s and that I would love to see, but it appears to be a lost film, is Gogala. And top right, you see the actual costume, the man in suit, Gogala. Looks quite different from the version on the poster in the center. Godzilla didn't pop up in American comic books until the 1970s. In fact, the first Godzilla comic ever published in America is that Godzilla versus Megalon that's pictured on the right here. That's scanned from my copy that I got at the movie Godzilla versus Megalon. It was a 4-page giveaway herald that some of the movie theaters used to promote the film. If you went and saw the movie, they gave you a copy when you bought your popcorn and your soda. The following year, 1977, is when Marvel Comics licensed Godzilla, and that was the first American Godzilla comic series. So 23 years after the film had opened in Japan, finally appeared in comic books in America. But in Japan, Gojira manga began the same year that Gojira originally opened. In October of 1954, the first Gojira manga was published. And Godzilla manga appeared in Japan, accompanying every one of the Kaiju films as they were made and released. Here in America, probably one of the last great examples of stop motion animation dinosaur characters is the dinosaur that was the top billed creature in the Valley of Gwangi from 1969. Ray Harryhausen created Gwangi. Gwangi was actually based on one of Willis O'Brien's unsold movie properties. And I won't go into the details of that, but it dated back to the 1940s. It was one of the many projects Willis O'Brien tried to get off the ground and couldn't. Harryhausen never forgot it. When the opportunity presented itself after 1 million years BC was such a worldwide smash hit in 1966, Harryhausen was able to convince his production partner, Charles H. Schneer, and Warner Brothers that finally making a feature film based on Willis O'Brien's idea for Gwangi was valid. Unfortunately, the film tanked. Warner Brothers by 1969 had changed hands. The new studio head had no interest in turning any of the work that came from the prior studio head into a box office hit, and they dumped The Valley of Gwangi essentially into matinee and second feature placement. I saw it when it played for a single weekend, Saturday, Sunday, in Burlington, Vermont. And that's the only time it ever played in a theater in northern Vermont. But it's a terrific movie. And if you want to check out a really great example of a Ray Harryhausen dino movie, this is the one. There was a Dell movie comic of Valley of Gwangi. That cover art is by Frank McCarthy. That is an adaptation of the movie poster art that Frank McCarthy did. Frank McCarthy being one of the great movie poster artists of the 60s. He did the movie poster art for films like The Dirty Dozen, Where Eagles Dare, The Green Beret, and so on. But he primarily loved Western themes. And when McCarthy retired from doing movie poster and promo art in the 1970s, he then began painting only Western themes. The interior art was by Jack Sparling. Jack Sparling, I was told by one of my teachers at the Kubert School, was one of those cartoonists who kept a timer by his drawing board. He had an egg timer like you would have in a kitchen. He would set the timer. When the timer went off, whatever page was on his board was done. Well, that means Gwangi doesn't have any teeth anywhere in the comic because, you know, it takes time to draw those teeth. Jim Danforth was a prominent protege, if you will, of Ray Harryhausen's. And Jim Danforth did the stop motion animation for the Hammer Films follow-up to 1 million years BC, a 1971 film called When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. It's not a particularly great film. I love it, but you know, this is the kind of movie that the Ringo Starr movie Caveman from the 1980s was making fun of. But it visually is terrific, and Jim Danforth's special effects were quite innovative. In fact, for this film, Jim Danforth introduced a form of blurring to try to deal with the frame-to-frame stutter that some people would recognize in stop-motion animation. And he would actually introduce a motion blur when he was moving the model and capture it on film, which made for smoother, more believable-looking animation. This film was actually nominated for an Academy Award in 1971. It did not win it, and it should have. It really was a remarkably innovative piece of work. Then in National Lampoon in 1972, a cartoonist named Rick Merowitz introduced the Dodosaurs. The Dodosaurs were the dinosaurs that didn't make it. This was a hilarious article, you know, series that appeared in National Lampoon. It was popular enough that Rick Merowitz not only did a follow-up piece in National Lampoon the next year, but a book of Dodosaurs came out before the end of the 70s. Really terrific stuff. If Rick Merowitz's use of watercolor and colored pencil looks at all familiar to you, he's the guy that did the artwork for the National Lampoon Animal House one-sheet poster. Probably the best known piece of work Rick Merowitz ever did. All right, let's wrap up by talking about dinosaurs attack. Let's go from the end of the 80s right up to the present day. You know, dinosaurs, as you can see, I hope I've demonstrated to you, never went away. Once there was a big dino boom in the 50s, you know, it is cyclical, and that dinosaurs fade and then become prominent again in the pop culture, but they never quite go away. At the end of the 80s, Topps, one of the main producers of bubblegum cards, they were the makers of the Garbage Pail Kids. They released a card series called Dinosaurs Attacks. It didn't do particularly well. This was like their own parody of their 1960s Mars Attacks bubblegum card series, quite infamous. And Dinosaurs Attacks presented these kind of scenarios of, you know, ridiculous images of dinosaurs encroaching on every aspect of contemporary life. They were quite gory, much like the old Mars Attacks cards were, but they're also quite brilliant. And a lot of the creatures I've shown you tonight make cameo appearances in the Dinosaur Attacks cards. Also around the 1980s, probably the most prominent and popular of all the pop paleontological artists was William Stout. William Stout he's a great guy, amazing person, a world traveler and adventurer as well. Bill actually spent not one, but a number of stints living for 6 months at a stretch in the South Pole with scientists, and then coming back and doing scientifically based paintings of prehistoric life forms whose fossils had been found in South America. I'm sorry, in the South Pole, in Antarctica. Bill Stout really came to prominence at the end of the 80s as a dinosaur artist, in part because Byron Price published a book called The Dinosaurs, completely packed with Bill Stout's artwork. Mark Schultz is also quite prominent in Bill Stout's generation. Mark Schultz is best known for being the creator of Xenozoic Tales, probably better known to most of you as Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. It originally was a one-shot story that appeared in the kitchen sink underground horror science fiction comic Death Rattle. It was the one breakout story from the Death Rattle run, and Kitchen Sink contracted with Mark Schultz, and they continued it as a comic series, independently published comic series, Xenozoic Tales. And it caught on with a readership enough that at one point it was adapted into other media as well. But the real redefinition of paleo pop culture for all of us here tonight is Jurassic Park, right? Michael Crichton's best-selling novel, Jurassic Park, completely redefined paleo pop culture for the 1990s. And when Steven Spielberg adapted that source novel to motion picture screens, it was a huge, huge international hit. I got to go to a preview of Jurassic Park in Massachusetts. In fact, one of the folks here tonight, Alan Goldstein, was with me, probably drove that night. I can't remember, maybe Alan remembers. And I remember us coming out of Jurassic Park and we were all blown away. But one of the discussions on the way home was, is that too intense to bring my kids to see? You bet your ass I brought my kids to see Jurassic Park. There's no way. If I had been a kid when Jurassic Park came out, I'd have been there. Just an amazing movie. But what's important about Jurassic Park in the chronology I'm talking about tonight is the stop motion animator Phil Tippett, who was a contemporary of Jim Danforth, the man who did the animation for When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. Phil Tippett was originally engaged by Steven Spielberg to do stop motion dinosaurs for Jurassic Park. Spielberg wanted state-of-the-art stop motion animation to realize all the wildlife in Jurassic Park. But one of Phil Tippett's contemporaries, a special effects artist named Dennis Murin, who had worked with Phil Tippett as one of the independent contractors who did the cutting edge state-of-the-art special effects for the Star Wars films, pointed out to Spielberg, and much to his initial regret, Phil Tippett, look, computer graphic imagery, CGI, has advanced to the point where we can make believable living animals now using CGI. And they took some of the stop motion tests that Phil Tippett had done, recreated them with CGI, and Phil Tippett realized Dennis was right. This was the next cutting edge wave for special effects recreations of prehistoric life, working in tandem with live action makeup special effects master Stan Winston, who created the full-size animatronic dinosaurs that also appear in Jurassic Park. Phil Tippett ended up becoming the dinosaur supervisor and the man who sort of orchestrated all the various aspects of how special effects were going to be done in the 21st century for Jurassic Park. And this made Phil Tippett the man who shepherded stop motion animation, cutting edge reconstructions of paleontological life forms into this new era of CGI animated life forms. Prior to Jurassic Park, there'd only been there were a number of films that used CGI, Terminator 2 and so on. But really, the only example I can think of that was successful before Jurassic Park is there's a short sequence in the Arnold Schwarzenegger action film Eraser, where these crocodiles are in some sort of display case in the middle of a posh restaurant or something, and they smash out of the case. Those were created with CGI, and those were the first living animals I ever saw that were convincing on screen with computer graphic animation, realizing them. But it was Jurassic Park that put it over the top. I mentioned this to you all during part one. If you want to understand how revolutionary Willis O'Brien's stop motion dinosaurs were in 1925, when the first audiences laid eyes on his special effects for the Lost World, the equal was when that Brachiosaurus was first shown in Jurassic Park. It was breathtaking when we first saw it. This did not mean that cutting edge CGI is how dinosaurs were done thereafter. What it did mean is that producers like Roger Corman, using whatever was affordable to him, right? Life-size animatronics, men in suit dinosaurs, puppetry, released a series of Jurassic Park wannabes based on a novel that predated Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. Before Jurassic Park ever saw print, a British novelist wrote a novel called Carnosaur, in which a scientist uses genetics to modify chicken eggs to hatch living dinosaurs. Roger Corman licensed the rights to that novel and released Carnosaur to theaters before Jurassic Park opened. Very typical of a producer like Roger Corman. Carnosaur was not a big hit in theaters. In fact, it only played in 3 or 4 theaters across the country, but it was a big hit on direct-to-video in video stores because it was the only dinosaur movie video stores had on their shelves when Jurassic Park was playing in theaters. Another low-budget producer, a man named Charles Band, had his own video label. He was getting distribution at the time through Paramount Pictures, so he was getting his product into video stores big time because he had a big studio distributing his work. He put out a quick and dirty dino movie about miniature dinosaurs that were friendly called Prehysteria. And as a result, Carnosaur had a whole series. There were 4 Carnosaur movies. By the 4th one, the Carnosaur license had kind of petered out, so they called it Raptor. Prehysteria had 3 titles that did well as series. And Prehysteria was one of the top rental films the year it came out in the video market. In comics, there was a number of writers and artists in my generation that had long been hankering to do dinosaur comics who finally got purchased and got a foothold. Dark Horse Comics, I approached them when I had the idea of, I'd been trying to sell my own dinosaur comic, Tyrant, for a number of years, and I couldn't get anybody to go for it. And when I approached Dark Horse Comics, they said, oh, we have a project a lot like yours. And it turned out that was Ricardo Delgado's Age of Reptiles, which is a great dinosaur comic. Ricardo is a consummate storyteller and artist. He had done a great deal of work as a storyboard artist and some aspects of production design for the motion picture and television industry. But Ricardo really, really cut loose with Age of Reptiles. And he's done a number of Age of Reptiles series that have been collected into paperback form. Highly, highly recommend them to you. His first issue of Age of Reptiles was in comic shops before I managed to get my first issue of Tyrant out. Tyrant was a self-published comic that I put together in my Wilmington, Vermont drawing studio. I did almost everything myself. I had the help of some friends. Alan Goldstein did the typesetting for the first 2 issues of Tyrant because he was much more savvy with computers than I was. Diana Schutz, a good friend of mine, editor at Dark Horse, I paid her to do the proofreading. And right from the beginning of work on what became the first issue of Tyrant, I was getting help from paleontologist and now very dear friend, Dr. Michael Ryan, who at that time was associated with a museum in Alberta, Canada. And Michael put me in touch with an entire circle of paleontologists that I was able to tap for the research to try to make Tyrant the most accurate as well as entertaining dinosaur comic that I possibly could. Ricardo presented Age of Reptiles as essentially a wordless comic. It's every one of the Age of Reptiles stories are presented as visual narratives. There's not captions, there's no word balloons. With Tyrant, I wrote Andrew the series, and I do have a narrative voice, an omniscient third-person voice that's telling the story. Jim Lawson, another good friend of mine. Jim Lawson was part of the original Mirage Studio crew that were responsible for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles once they began expanding from the comics just being done by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles creators, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, and other artists began to join Mirage Studios. Jim Lawson was prominent among them. And I think Jim Lawson has probably drawn more pages of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle art than any other North American artist. Jim also wanted to do his own dinosaur comic, and he launched a comic called Paleo, Tales of the Late Cretaceous. Later, they were collected into book form by Dover Books, and this is the book I recommend to you, Paleo, the Complete Collection. I provided an introduction for this book, and I also scripted some original stories that Jim illustrated for Paleo. So I don't see Ricardo or Jim or any of the other people whose work I'll be showing you in a moment as competitors. We're all in this together, and we're all in the dinosaur cartooning tribe, and the more the merrier as far as I'm concerned. I love all this stuff. Ryan North was an online comics creator, and Ryan North was like, he was primarily a comedy writer. He's very funny, very witty, and Ryan was one of the early adopters of online comics, net comics. And what he did is he repeats the same 6 panels in every strip with slight modifications, just rewriting the word balloons. And it's brilliant stuff. His dinosaur comic has been running for years and years and years, and there is a print collection of Ryan's dinosaur comic, and it's really funny stuff. Most recently, I struck up a friendship with Tad Galusha after a couple of my friends mentioned there was this new book out called Cretaceous that came out in 2019. And I love what Tad did with this. I highly recommend Cretaceous. Tad originally did it as a self-contained series. I'm hoping he'll return to it someday or do more paleontological themed graphic novels. Tad has done other work in other genres and for other publishers, but I highly recommend Cretaceous. Everything really changed as well when Tim Haynes and Jasper James produced a 6-episode, quote, nature documentary, unquote, using cutting-edge CGI. And it was a series called Walking with Dinosaurs. It premiered on BBC One as a miniseries between October and November of 1999. And then the following year was broadcast in the United States. And it was followed by a number of other of these sort of fake nature documentaries about prehistoric life, presented as if they were like, David Attenborough documentaries, only all the footage is being created with CGI. Walking with Dinosaurs, it was followed by Walking with Beasts in 2001. Then they did a prequel series called Walking with Monsters in 2005 that covers the life forms that predated the dinosaurs. And there was a feature film that came out in 2013. Disney had been trying to mount their own animated dinosaur film for quite a number of years. It was a project that was spearheaded by a writer named Wallen Green. And it finally was completed in the year 2000, released as Dinosaur. These days, my grandkids are growing up with stuff that was unimaginable when I was a kid. There's all these CGI cutting edge dinosaur educational series for kids: Dinosaur Train, Dinosaur Dan, Dinosaur Dana. It's great stuff, and wouldn't exist without Jurassic Park having changed the entire media landscape for film and television recreations of prehistoric life. Of course, that also means that after Jurassic Park had its 3-series run, Steven Spielberg, as a producer, went back to the well, and we're now coming up to our 3rd Jurassic World feature film about to be released. And there's been a Jurassic World TV series, Camp Cretaceous. I love this stuff, right? My critical faculty shut down when I watch these movies. I have a great time with them. Most recently, an animated series premiered in October of 2019, Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. He had quite a success, pardon me, with an animated Star Wars series. And this was his successor. Please pardon me as I pop a cough drop. And that's it. I didn't start coughing till the last slide. How's that? I hope you really enjoyed the talk. Went on for a while, didn't it? Actually, not too bad. What is it? 8:30, so about 90 minutes. Special thanks to Jackson College, Jackson District Library, Nostalgia Inc., and ConCon for sponsoring this series. I also want to thank Dr. Michael Ryan, the Center for Cartoon Studies, where I taught for 15 years, and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and Carleton University in Ottawa. They sponsored and hosted earlier versions of this presentation. And I also have to thank Don Glut, who has a terrific website on paleo pop culture that's still online. My friend Mark Arsenault provided a couple images I wasn't able to find in quick order. All my paleo pals and peers out there. And I guess we're ready for questions now. I'll let somebody else talk for a moment.
Hey, Stephen, so we had this, John. There was a question a while back about goofy dinosaurs, like the one from the Arctic Superman series.
Oh yeah.
And the question was, is there an origination, or do you know like the origin of what?
Yeah, Prehistoric Peeps.
Okay.
Prehistoric Peeps, that E.T. Reed series from Punch. They featured tons of crazy ass, completely imaginary, goofy dinosaurs. So it really starts there. There were a number of other prominent humorous cartoonists and artists, primarily in England, because of course Charles Darwin first was published in England with The Origin of Species. And there was a lot of satirical cartooning surrounding the controversy over the theories of natural selection and evolution. And all of those featured completely fabricated, crazy, imaginary, variations on prehistoric life forms. And there were also some terrific artists, like there was an artist named Lawson Wood, who followed E.T. Reed, but because he was a better color watercolorist, his prehistoric caveman and dinosaur artwork was really quite popular, 1890s, early 1900s, particularly in England.
Abu's got his hand up. Go ahead, Abu.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Take your time. Are you all right, sir?
Mm-hmm. I think I wore my voice out, but bring it on. I'll be sipping.
Okay, sir. Was there any toy line featuring dinosaurs that you really loved? Because during 1980s, it was a toy boom. toys were like booming,
Oh yeah, yeah,
cartoon shows and all that. Like,
yeah.
was there a toy which captivated, caught your attention with dinosaur designs? The best one.
You know, in terms of what was at the toy stores, the Jurassic Park dinosaurs were really cool, right? I bought a few of them and I had them in my studio. If any of you remember those toys, some of them had like a piece of flesh that you could pull out of them. They had like, you know, and they had some name for it, like featuring Dino Bite. I don't remember what they called it, right? But the best ones, Abu, to answer your question, were right before Jurassic Park hit.
Mhm.
Actually, perhaps even 5 years before Jurassic Park, but they really caught on after Jurassic Park. The British Museum began to put out a series of plastic dinosaur replicas that are still probably some of the best, you know, replicas of prehistoric life available as plastic figures. I know I bought a lot of those and had them in my drawing studio, and I remember many of the cartoonists that I would visit during those years I was conventioning. You know, if I got to visit their studio, they had a couple of them in there too. And if you look at Marvel comics in particular that came out around that time, like there was a revival of Kazar and Savage World and so on, I can tell which cartoonists had those British plastic toys that they were using as reference when they were drawing their pages. Since then, there's been just tons of great. I mean, if you're willing, there are diehard collectors of, you know, dinosaur toys, and there's just, you know, state-of-the-art museum quality figures available now. They're pricey, but if you're just talking about the kind of toys that you could find at a nature store or a museum gift shop and some toy stores, those British museum figures are still the best.
Mhm.
Sorry
Hey,
about
so-
the clicking. If you're hearing clicking, it's the cough drop that I got going between.
Oh,
my
no problem.
You're
Oh, I
good.
just-
Happens.
So somebody commented that's called dino damage.
Yeah, I got
Yeah.
dino damage, right?
Yeah, dino
exactly.
damage. SFT said here, are you aware of the art book All Yesterdays? Or are you familiar with the authors? And he just listed it here.
I might. Let me get out of this. I'm going to get out of the screen share. Stop sharing. There we go. And All Yesterdays. Am I familiar with the authors? Let me click on this and see. I have so many dino books.
I thought about making it a Rickroll, but you know, I thought, no, this is probably too much. No, this is a book that I got from my wife. I don't know where she found it, but she heard about it a couple of years back, and she bought it for me.
Yeah,
as
I
like a
do have that.
surprise
Yes,
Christmas
I do have
gift.
that book. It's a
It's
book of
amazing.
very, yeah, it's a book of very strange, unorthodox reconstructions of prehistoric lives. And they really favor fat dinosaurs in it.
Yeah, they
Like,
do.
a lot of them look very bovine, you know. You know, the funny thing about that, I've got that book and I've got another book that's similar to it with very inventive, imaginative reconstruction of prehistoric animals. One of the things we have to keep in mind is every generation has recreated dinosaurs, right? And all the things that were considered true when I was growing up were thrown out at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, when they realized that all the archetypes that have been attached to dinosaurs were just scientifically incorrect, right? They didn't drag their tails on the ground. They weren't cold-blooded, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that continues to be true for each generation. And I look forward to seeing how it changes again. I'm working on a big graphic novel project right now that's going to carry me into, I don't know, 2024 probably. But my hope is to get back to work on Tyrant. But one of the problems is I have to redraw all the animals I drew because we now know they didn't look like that. And even though I was getting very good advice from very knowledgeable paleontologists, those models have changed quite radically. I'll just make one reference for you that'll illuminate. Dr. Jack Horner, who's probably one of the best known pop paleontologist, but Jack is a very serious paleontologist, presented a lecture 3-4 years ago that I was invited to, I got to attend, where he showed the skulls of various ceratopsians. And on the slides, he had the Latin names that had been affixed to those skulls. Well, because of how there have been so many advances in how they are able to analyze the skeletal structure, the bone structure, the organic molecular structure of fossils now, he pointed out that, and I'm just pulling a number out of my head here, please don't take this as gospel. He pointed out that 4 to 6 of those species may have been the one species, because the skulls of ceratopsians were made of a morphologically plastic bone substance that meant that at different points in the animal's life cycle, they could grow different forms off those skulls. So what we think is what we have believed for years now to have been a number of species of ceratopsians may have simply been, and who knows what it was for, it may have been a mating adornment, right? They may have grown horns or extensions of their frills to attract a mate. And because of the nature of the tissue, as they aged, it could morph back into the skull. Dr. Horner pointed out that the only living animal that has that same sort of tissue is a bird called the cassowary, where the males grow these crests as they mature, and the crest plays a role in their mating patterns and habits. This is mind-blowing stuff, and I'm just giving you one example of the kind of stuff that's possible now. So, yes, I do know that book only yesterday's. I apologize I didn't recognize it right off, Stephen, but I kid you not, probably 250 to 350 paleontology books up in my studio. Once I saw the cover, I recognized it. Yeah, it's a great book.
I had a doubt. Oh, sorry.
Hold on, yep, just one second, because I think we got a good question that goes off of that.
Okay.
Is that Adam David asked, when you go back to Tyrant, will you be giving the dinosaurs feathers?
Some. Dr. Michael Ryan provided me with an entire plethora of papers on T-Rex that argue pretty convincingly that adult T-Rexes probably did not have feathers. But some of the animals that I'll be depicting, I'm relocating Tyrant, right? When I did the series in the 1990s, I had set it in what is now Alberta, Canada. I have been convinced by Dr. Ryan and some of the other paleontologists in his circle to relocate the setting to where the Hell Creek Formation is in the northwestern United States, because there's a richer fossil record there. So it actually gives me more life forms to work with as characters. So yeah, some of them I'll be, I am going to reconstruct them to the form that we now believe they had. That will include some having feathers. But as a storyteller, part of the fun when I was doing Tyrant, when I had the money and the time to lavish on the research the way I wanted to, where I could go to the annual Society of Vertebrate Paleontology symposiums and conferences, and when I could spend every day just reading about and studying and thinking about dinosaurs, as well as writing and drawing on Tyrant, I was asking questions that a couple of paleontologists told me nobody's ever asked that before, right? Because here's an example. So part of Tyrant's story is his initial time in the nest. And one of my questions is, what would keep 4 newly hatched Tyrannosaurus Rex infants from eating each other? Like, why? How would they even survive their nesting period? What would, what mechanism was there that they wouldn't just kill and eat one another, right? I also had questions like, there's still an ongoing battle in certain paleontological circles about what were the feeding habits of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. In short, was it an active predator where it hunted down and killed and ate its prey, or was it a scavenger? Well, as a storyteller, I look at that and I go, well, okay, I'm going to have 3 of the babies survive of the 4 that were in the nest. I'm going to have 1 come out crippled. He's going to be a scavenger because he's not strong enough to hunt. So I can play out as a storyteller the paleontological scientific model of T-Rex as a scavenger. But I can also play out that there's a reason that my protagonist, Tyrant, a female Tyrannosaurus Rex, is my hero or heroine of my series. She's the strongest of the 3 that survived the nest. I want to portray her as so superior a predator that one of the climaxes in the stories that I want to tell involves her being able to hunt without moving. She doesn't have to leave where she is because she's that good. And I'm not going to give away what it is because some other cartoonist will take it and do it. And the other surviving sibling was going to do both, right? When it was hungry and there was no available living prey that it could down, it ate whatever was around. It would scavenge. But when there was ample available prey that it could track and kill, it was an active predator. For me as a storyteller, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm a layperson. So to me, this is all fodder for story ideas. And I was told more than once, probably 3 or 4 times over the 4 years I got to the SVP conferences, I was told more than once, you're asking questions no one's asked yet. Because I wasn't asking scientific questions. I was asking pragmatic questions about how life forms might behave because I was struggling with telling a story. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay, next question.
I was going to go right into here. So 1 second. I got one more in the comments, Abu, and then I'll come back to you just so we have a little bit of variety here. That there's supposedly Aiden asked, have you heard about the rumors that there's supposed to be a Jurassic Park Fast and the Furious crossover?
I'd go in a heartbeat.
And what did you think? Okay, that's what he really wanted to know.
Look, you all got to understand something. I was writing. If you're interested in my writing, I wrote for every issue of a fanzine that you can buy off Amazon that's called Monster. Monster ! And one of the editors is my friend Tim Paxton, Paxton. So if you need to search on Amazon, type in Monster ! And Paxton, it'll bring you to one of the issues and you'll find the rest of them. They did 32 issues of Monster, and I wrote a large article in every issue. In one issue, when Jurassic World first came out, the first Jurassic World came out, there was so much bullshit online about the worst dinosaur movie that I wrote an article saying, no, these are the worst dinosaur movies, right? And I made the point that I grew up watching movies that would run, an hour to 90 minutes. And I would sit through that running time if it meant I got to see one guy in a suit with a zipper up his back once, right? That sometimes is all we got, right? So for people to bitch about Jurassic World, where I'm like, holy shit, it's filled with dinosaurs. They all look amazing. Yes, it may not be a model of cinematic art. It may not be a great piece of storytelling. But for me, as someone who's been watching dinosaurs in the pop culture since I was 3 years old, you guys are living in fucking heaven, okay? You are in the heaven of paleo pop culture right now. It is unbelievable what's on the screen. And I have fun with all of it. So Fast and Furious and Jurassic World, I'm there. I just want to know which one of them is going to eat the rock. That's all I need to know. So
I said to my friend about Thanos, I was like, he doesn't look like Thanos. He's like, dude, I've been waiting for 30 years to see Thanos.
There you go. That's why
he's like, I don't care.
That's why
like,
I take superhero junkiedom and change it to dino junkiedom. That's me, right?
Right. I'm like, fair enough. Okay, Abu, go ahead. I think this will be the last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead, Abu.
So I remember a show called this Jim Henson's Dinosaur TV
Oh
show.
yeah, the TV series.
Are you aware? Yeah, dinosaurs. What is your reaction? What is your review of this entire show as a whole?
Um,
Dinosaur.
I'll start, Abu, by telling you, I must confess, I still have all the video cassettes of the Dinosaurs TV series in my garage. All right. I bought them as they came out, and I just found them like 2 months ago. And I was like, oh my God, I've got like all 10 volumes of dinosaurs, right? You know, it's the Flintstones. What Jim Henson did was he took what Hanna-Barbera had done in 1960, and
Mhm.
he took the Honeymooners, which is a TV series you didn't grow up with. It was a very popular American TV series with Jackie Gleason. It was about working class people living, eking out lives in the city, but as a comedy, as a situation comedy. And Henson went, well, I'm a puppeteer. I don't have to make them cavemen. I'll make them dinosaurs. And they did the Dinosaurs TV series. You know, I enjoyed it. It was pretty dopey. I mean, as a Muppets fan, I have to confess that, you know, the first Muppet movie and Dark Crystal are much higher on my personal list of favorite Muppet things. But it's just cool that it even existed. It didn't really catch a wave because I think it only lasted one season, if I remember correctly. It didn't really find but who knows what, I don't know what the threshold was for TV series at that time. What, it didn't bring in 5 million people, so it was a loser? I don't know. But it was pretty cool, you know, and my kids loved it, you know, when I can't believe the dinosaur media my kids grew up with. It was the stuff my generation couldn't even imagine being possible. The pre-hysteria movies with the little friendly dinosaurs and the kids, they're awful movies. But, you know, kids love that stuff. And I'd have loved them when I was 5 years old, 6 years old. So
Also Theodore Rex. I remember seeing that with my mother on HBO. Like it's like some Mandela effect. I was like, I seen some weird dinosaur movie on TV with Whoopi Goldberg, but I forgot the name.
Theodore Rex, right? That's Theodore Rex.
Theodore Rex.
I cannot recommend that. But don't forget, the Super Mario Brothers movie had a great dinosaur in it, right? Had a great dinosaur in it. And it also had Dennis Hopper was the villain in the Super Mario Brothers movie, and he turned into a dinosaur man, right? So, you know, dinosaurs are everywhere. I'm up for any of it, but I'm a cheap date. You know, let's face it, I'm a cheap date with this stuff. So,
thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Well, I just want to wrap it up. There was lots of good comments. Man, Stephen, whenever we're doing this series, I come away with like about 7 things that I could follow for the rest of my life and never catch it all. Like I did just get the Lost World on the Alley Flicks version of it, and I've been watching it. It's phenomenal.
Oh, the 1925 one.
Yeah,
that's a great
really,
movie. You know?
It is really great. So, and then the restored parts do make a big difference, like in the beginning of the journey and all that stuff. So thank you for the recommendation. And there was a comment earlier about Mad God, and Mad God is out, just to let everybody know, but you can only see it through film festivals currently.
Right,
so
right.
You gotta,
that's how I first saw it, was at through Fantasia Fest in Montreal. And
phenomenal.
I hope it comes out, you know, in a more generally available streaming platform. I'm looking forward to owning it on physical media so I can go frame by frame.
It is so deeply rich. It's incredible.
There's no dinosaurs in it, but it's an amazing feat of stop motion animation art.
But the layering of it is incredible. I mean, so if you like Phil Tippett, you will like that movie. I can guarantee you that. Just want to say too, like that's what mostly there, and there's some good comments there about the meaty answers that you gave. So we really appreciate another night with everybody. Thanks for sticking on. Next week is Manga Before Tezuka, so that's where we're giving away the stuff that Steven sent us. It's in a Facebook post on ConCon if you want to check it out and rev it up. If you know other fans of Steven that might really enjoy something, I mean, you probably won't tell anybody because you want to keep it for yourself. But if you want to, let other people know there'll be some signed stuff available. Let people know. And like Steven said, these are available. They're actually available on jacksonconcon.org's website on past ConCon stuff, and they're all linked in there, so you could watch these however you want. Hook it up to your TV, turn the sound up, get some popcorn.
I'll also mention to you all, I did come down with what I'm pretty sure is just a cold on Sunday night, which is part of why at the end of this I was starting to lose my voice. I did get tested for COVID today. I'm waiting for the results. I don't believe I have COVID. I have been vaccinated twice. I got my booster. I just think I've got a winter cold, a fall cold. So I appreciate your concern, and I'm sorry I kind of choked at the end, but at least it was on the last slide when it hit me. So
You
there
Get
did
well
good.
soon, sir. Get well soon.
Thank you.
You did awesome. So
Get
everybody,
well
we
soon.
will see you next week. And then the last note I'll tell you is in January, we're switching to Tuesdays to accommodate Dr. Tucky's schedule. So just make sure we have an updated schedule up there and on the Facebook page. So if you just check that out, we'll be good for the 2022.
Can I ask, who should, I take it people get notices via email, is that correct? If they
Correct. Yep.
So if you've got questions, I imagine you can bounce a question back to that email, and Stephen Tucky is nodding and thumbing up. So
Yeah.
that change of venue of evening will not start until January. Next week, our last talk of this year is still going to be on Wednesday at 7 o'clock.
Got it. That is right. So we'll see y'all next week. Have a safe week. Stay out of trouble, but not too much. All right.
Thanks,
take it easy.
everybody.
Yep.
Have a
Bye,
good one.
sir. Bye, everyone.